design. Yacht designer was my original. I was a ship builder, boat builder, yacht builder.
That's brilliant. I saw a documentary recently on how boats are made. Riveting.
Yeah.
There we go. On that note, we'll
Yeah.
get started. So thank you everyone for joining us. It's great to see so many of you popping up in the chat. We're obviously something a bit different this week with a bunch of Australian whiskies, or whiskies, or spirits from Oz, with this return to Oz sort of set. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, we obviously want these to be, I can see actually recognize a lot of the names here, so I think most of you have probably been on before, but obviously, as per usual, want to get your thoughts, your questions, your tasting notes, your kind of thoughts in the chat. So don't be shy. Stephen's the only one to comment so far, but do keep any kind of questions or thoughts coming. Dave, before you actually do maybe more formal introduction, but introduce yourself to everyone on the chat. Do you want to just maybe run through the order? So I know some people like to have them poured out in front of them.
Sure. I would like to start with the Gospel, which looks remarkably like this on the label. So this is the one with the tapestry label. It's called the Gospel. It's a rye. It's a 3-year-old rye. And then I'm going to go on to the Tria Prima, which is a 2-year-old tawny single malt. And then we're going to go into the Corowa, which is a 4-year-old single malt, 48.5% ABV. And then there's 2 peated ones, one lightly peated, with Chief's son of the Chief, 5-year-old, 52.1% ABV. And we'll finish on the Riverbourne, which is another 2-year-old, 51%.
Fantastic. Excellent.
So one rye, 4 single malts.
Marvelous. So now that people can get that arranged in front of them, do you want to tell us a bit about yourself, Dave, and how you ended up in front of us tonight representing that boutique whiskey company?
Sure. Yeah, my name is Dave Worthington. I am the brand ambassador for that boutique whiskey company. I'm just a bit of an all-round whiskey geek. I started writing about whiskey back in 2010. I started a little whiskey blog. Started a little whiskey club in Bedford, started going to whiskey shows, loved going to whiskey shows, wanted to work on the other side, called up a person and said, would you need a hand? Basically just being a brand buddy, like you, volunteering at whiskey festivals, and one thing led into another. The blog got pretty big. And I'd worked for Balcones, I'd worked for Weems, I'd worked for Douglas Lang. In fact, anybody at a whiskey show would trust my daughter and myself, because it was a father and daughter thing that we used to do, would just trust us to, could you just look up the stand for a little while? I've got to do a masterclass. And in 2016, I wanted to go to Whiskey Live, and I wanted to be there all weekend, and I wanted to work it. So I called up Balcones, and they said, no, we've got someone there. And I called up, no, Balcony said, well, we know Michael needs someone on Boutique. So I called Boutique up. Obviously, I knew the brand, I knew the people there, and they said, yeah, come on board. And that was the first time we had Boutique Whiskey, April 2016. And after that weekend, they called me up and said, can you do another one for us? I said, sure. It's in Bristol, they said. Okay. I said, oh, you're on your own. No problem. I'll do that. And did that very successfully. And then they called me up and said, this is the list of shows we've committed to this year. Which ones can't you do? I said, well, I can do them all because they're all at weekends. And they said, oh, we'd like your daughter to do all the American craft with you as well. So yeah, we just had a blast. My daughter and I traveling up and down the country doing every whiskey show that they had committed to that year. And then halfway through that year, they called me up and said, how would you like to do this full time, Dave? And I said, are you serious? I called my daughter up and she said, you've handed your notice in, haven't you, Dad? I said, no, not yet. No. Yeah, my background is engineering. Whiskey was just a passion, a hobby. And yeah, my kids said, you don't need to work anymore, Dad. You know, you don't need to work for us. It's what you enjoy doing. So that's how I ended up here. Right place, right time, and being a passionate whiskey nerd. as a passionate whiskey nerd, working for someone like that boutique whiskey company, which is, you know, an independent bottler, is just a dream for a whiskey nerd, because I have to know stories about so many whiskies, all of the Scotch distilleries, as well as all of the global distilleries. So yeah, it's still like I'm running a blog, but I get paid for it now, and it's full time.
Oh, fantastic. No, that's quite a different journey into the industry. Most people who come on here as brand ambassadors go, well, I worked in the cocktail bar for a while, and then now I do this. You know, so I think your story is much more interesting, Dave. Brilliant. So do you want to will we start with the gospel batch one and come on to and then maybe, you know, for those people who maybe aren't that familiar with that boutique company, maybe we could talk a bit about that.
So let's pour some gospel. I'm a huge rye whiskey lover, so I'm glad we've got some Australian rye. I just want to talk about the Australian whiskey boom, really, because it's only been about 10 years that Australian whiskey has really been out there. And the recent growth of Australian whiskies has just been phenomenal. If I look at the 2007 whiskey yearbook, I think I counted just 5 distilleries in the whole of Australia and New Zealand, just 1 in New Zealand and 4 in Australia. This is back in 2007. In this latest edition, and I've just counted it before you came on air tonight, 92 Australian and New Zealand. So the 81 in Australia and 11 in New Zealand. Wow. So this revival has really gone from strength to strength. Which really started in 1992 with Bill Lark and his Lark Distillery in Hobart, Tasmania. And Bill really was the first person to be granted a distilling license in Tasmania in 153 years. And this is always this figure that's quoted. And I thought, no, surely there must be more to Australian whiskey than this. Yeah, I did do a bit of digging into history, and I've got a load of history to tell you about. But this is a rye whiskey. It's 3 years old. It's from a little distillery in the back streets of Melbourne's sort of iconic, trendy, eccentric Brunswick neighbourhood. It's a 3-year-old Australian rye, and it's been bottled at 58.6%, which is natural cask strength. On our labels, we have a little NCS up in the top left-hand corner. Now, this is very much an American-style rye whiskey made in Australia. It's made from a mash bill of 51% Australian unmalted rye and 49% malted barley. And it has been, all of it's been cultivated and sort of by a single farmer in the region. It's a really big, powerful whiskey, and it makes great old fashions and Manhattans, 2 of the best cocktails in the world, in my eyes. Manhattans on Mondays, old fashions on Fridays. Just an old fashioned sort of guy.
Oh, brilliant. Craig has said it's got a real hit on the nose, dark cherries, heavy dark chocolate. There's something on the nose I find personally really familiar that I can't quite place. But it's it belies its age as well on the nose. Anyway, I haven't tasted it yet. Curtis says that's a beauty of a rye whiskey, def up there with the best options or best of the US ones. That's brilliant.
Yeah, what's on here? This one, I'm sure this one has been in a red wine cask afterwards. Yes, it's originally gone into a new American charred oak, as would be American whiskey. The distillery story being set up here, which we tell the label on our story on our label. Two friends, one American, one Australian, went through a trial and error of how to. But they wanted to make whiskey, build a distillery, and they went through a really long trial and error of trying different things. Almost destroyed the distillery, hand mashing, all of it set the distillery on fire, nearly blew a still up, and then they went back into a rye whiskey, which is what they both loved. And I went for the American style of rye, and it is a distillery that I have just started seeing over here as well. You can see not a lot of Australian whiskey gets over here because we're not their main market. Their main market is Australia and Southeast Asia region. But this has been in a red wine cask, an Australian red wine cask finish. which is why we get a lot of fruity notes on here.
No,
It's bold and tasty.
And it's got that really lovely balance between the tannins and the spice as well. You really wouldn't think this was 3 years old.
Rye whiskey generally is pretty young. On the whole, rye whiskey is pretty young. In fact, I mean, back in the day when rye was the prevalent spirit of the state, to go back to Pennsylvania rye was pretty much unaged, and it only went into barrels for transportation, and then they realized that actually it's starting to mellow it out, and certainly with the way Americans distill, things are slightly different where they need that new charred oak to take away some of those undesirable fractions that, say, Scotch whiskey takes out through their cuts. But yes, a big, bold, powerful rye. Absolutely love what they're doing here. All of our labels, that boutique whiskey company, an independent bottler, started 10 years ago, September 2012. So we'll be celebrating our 11th birthday this year. And we've always been a big, passionate whiskey nerds. There is an ethos between us in the whiskey team. As soon as we try something new, we want to go and share it with the rest of the team. You've got to try this. Oh man, you've got to try this. I came back from Ireland on holiday with my wife, 2 weeks in Ireland. I visited five of those days out of those 2 weeks were with whiskey people, tasting some amazing stuff in new distilleries. And I've come back with boxes of samples, which I want to get in front of the team because you've got to try this. We are very much that sort of mentality between us. We are big whiskey nerds right amongst ourselves. So yeah, we started 2012 as an independent bottler with 2 single malts from arguably the most collectible Scottish distilleries, Ardbeg and Macallan, and 2 single malts from the long closed Scottish distilleries, Capadonic and Port Ellen, closed in 2002 and 1983, and maybe it's going to be coming back soon, Port Ellen. But right from the start, we wanted to be a little bit different, certainly from every other independent bottler, although more and more I look around these days and everyone seems to have boutique whiskey labels these days. We don't call them cartoons, we call them graphic novel style labels. That was our first significant departure from convention, and every label tells a story. Now, every distillery will keep its own label. You know, our Port Ellen is exactly the same label with every batch. Our Ardbeg, there's always one little change in the label that we play, this sort of a Where's Wally sort of thing. So although we can't put Ardbeg or the name of the distillery in big letters on our labels because that's the rules of independent bottling, we make our labels identifiable very quickly. You get to know us. And you can quickly recognize, oh, that's the Ardbeg label, or this is the Port Ellen label, or this is the Macallan label, or whatever they are, as the batches change. Now, we have had to change a couple of labels over the time. One through a customer asking, or the distillery asking if we'd respectfully change their label. They weren't a big fan of their label that we came up with, and they asked us to change it.
Which distillery was that?
That was Tomatin. We had a really cheesy tin of tomatoes, Tomatin. Yeah, some of our labels are very, very corny, but yeah, every label tells a story. And they asked if could we change that. They don't like that tin of tomatoes. It was really like a cheap supermarket tin of tomatoes with little Tommy tomato on there. So they asked us to change that one, and we had to change 2 labels that looked a bit too childish. Our Tobermory label looked very much like Balamory, which was a children's TV program, all bright and colourful. I think the Portland group or the Fun Place came in and told us off for that one. And the other,
well, I mean, the Balamory was filmed in Tobermory, was it not? So it is literally Balamory, like, you know. It
was Tobermory Harbour, but it looked a bit too much like Balamory. What's the story, Balamory? And the other one was the pirate ship on the Tormore label that we had to change.
And which distillery is the My Lovely Horse one?
My Lovely Horse is a secret Irish distillery making single malt that could be triple distilled. We're not allowed to put the name on the label, but it could be triple distilled.
Oh, it could be triple distilled, and I'd say it's quite up north in that case as well. Then
it's quite up north, yeah. Yes, it's that basalt rock sort of formation that links over to Stafford Island, the Giant's Causeway or something. It's not too far away from there.
Interesting. I wonder what it could be. Mel has said Danish rye bread slash toffee on this one. Craig says really rich and oily, chewy in the mouth, like rye whiskey, and this is excellent. Rich rye bread taste with massive hits of dark maraschino cherries and dark chocolate mousse into peppery rye spice and long okay finish. Really excellent rye. Brilliant. Keep the tasting notes coming. I'll just, before you continue on, because what you're saying there, David, this one is $74.95 on our website with 15% off. The code will obviously be given at the end for anyone who's wondering. And it's 58.6% ABV, I think. Am I right there, Dave?
This one is, I can look at it, is 58.6%. It is a single cask. These are all of these Australian whiskies that we're tasting tonight. In fact, the whole series are single cask. We've never said, I'm just going to pop the line up on there, but the whole of them, we've never said single cask on our labels. And we don't put an awful lot on our labels, I must admit. It's something I've been trying to change, but at the moment we're not. But we do put a little, that's the full lineup of all the whiskies and the brandy that we released as our return to Oz. It's our second series of Australian whiskies.
Craig has asked how many bottles in this release?
This one is just, I wrote it down, 434 bottles is what it says on this label. It's actually a little bit less than that, although it says 454 bottles on here, because each label is actually numbered, bottle number 1 to whatever it is. We have to add a couple of extra spare labels because we've been caught before when the label machine eats one of the labels as we're bottling it, and then we have to put a spare one, and we've had XXs going out where we run out of numbers, so now we just add a few, we put 10% more on or something like that. So there will be some additional ones, but the amount of bottle will be less than what it actually says on there because it is a single cask at cask strength. This is our label for this. It tells the story, mostly brought together as a tapestry style of label, with all of the incidents that the guys told us about with their hand mashing, with their Murray Mallee farm that they use, and lots. We tried to turn it into a little tapestry, with the still nearly blowing up, with them trying to drop the still on themselves. And with our first Australian whiskey collection, we tried to put we put the Southern Cross constellation on every one of the labels, hidden either rivets on a still or a little flag somewhere, or in the constellation in the sky. And wherever Bill Lark had a hand in the new distilling, we used to hide a little lark on the label. This series, we've gone for deadly animals because just about everything in Australia wants to kill you, and our deadly animal for the Australian rye whiskey from the Gospel is the salty, which we've got there on the bottom of the label.
Excellent. And you said this distillery is based in Melbourne?
It is in Melbourne, yes. Yeah, eclectic Brunswick neighbourhood, apparently.
My brother actually moved to Melbourne in March, so I'm hoping to. I've never been out to Australia, but I promised him I'd visit him early next year. So I might try and arrange a visit when I'm down there. Alistair's asked about the size of these bottles. These are 50s. I mean, these are definitely 50 cl bottles. He was saying, are they still 50 cl bottles? Is that the way it's going to remain?
Yeah, boutique whiskey always have done 50 cl bottles. We only have one 70 cl bottle because these batches have been always so small. In fact, when we first started, some of the earlier parcels were even smaller than this. Yeah, we've done two 70 cl, which are repeatable blends, effectively. The World Whiskey Blend, which I can see somewhere over the back there. And we also did an Out of This World Whiskey Blend, which was a little bit older. These are the 70 cls, the repeatable ones that we can do. But everything else we do is generally single cask these days. I say we never say it, but generally they are. There's very few now that come out today that aren't single cask. But we used to batch some casks together when we were before everything changed in the world a little while ago. Where we used to batch a few casks together, but nowadays we tend to stick them out as single casks and offer exclusives to certain customers in certain regions because it's easier that way. Similar casks. But yes, 50cl is the way we're going still at the moment. And certainly the next couple of releases that I've seen are all 50cl. We've got no intentions to change. The only way we'd be changing is if we're doing more continuous lines because they are single casks, and some of these batches are very, very small.
Fantastic. And David's got said that water softens the alcohol burn, but adds sweetness. And now I regret finishing mine before I added water to it. Do you have any strong opinions on water ice in the whiskey, Dave?
No, I don't. I mean, I do take all of these down. When I've got cask samples coming on the desk, yeah, I'll take them right down to 20. I'm doing tasting notes at 20%. But I'll always nose and taste them neat first, and then I'll take them right down. We always do that. It's just what most whiskey people do. And if you take lots of samples, we don't want to get legless. You know, we want to be able to find those things that are wrong, and you'll only find that by moving the alcohol. So we do that with all of the samples that we get. We take them right down. I like drinking whiskey. I love drinking whiskey. There's very rarely will I drink a lot of whiskey out of a Glen can unless I'm taking a picture of it for the gram or something like that. But generally, I'm on a tumbler. I love a whiskey tumbler. I love a big glass whiskey tumblers, and I've got lots of different tumblers because I like drinking whiskey. But yeah, new whiskies I tend to put in a proper tasting and proper nosing glasses. And if I'm sitting there contemplating with a really expensive whiskies, yes, then I'll tend to. But when I'm drinking whiskey, I just want it in a rocks glass.
All right. Sorry.
I very rarely put ice in a whiskey unless I'm making a cocktail. Very rarely, mainly because I don't generally have an awful lot of ice in the house. Adding water, unless it's too hot for me, then yes, I will. But if I feel it balanced out of the bottle and I feel this is beautiful drinking it at natural cask strength, it works perfectly for me. But you know, everybody's different, and you do what's right for you. I do always have a teaspoon on my desk for water because I can never find the bloody pipette, but I can always find a teaspoon. And by adding, you can just drip water in with a teaspoon. It's much more controllable than a lovely. I've got a beautiful jug as well, but it's difficult to control. So it's much easier to dip the teaspoon in and just drag it in there like that.
No, definitely. Do you want to? Is there anything you want to add on the gospel, or will we come on to the Prima?
We can come on to the Prima. Yeah, we can talk about Australian whiskey while I'm running through onto the next one.
Perfect.
I'll put the label up there. Prima. The new deadly animal is the what's the blue? It's a blue winged octopus, which you can see on the man's shoulder there, which is Tria Prima. He is the Tria Prima, bringing the three things together. Yeah, whiskey, Australia. Now, I first tasted my first Australian whiskey 10 years ago. 10 years ago in March, it was with Dominic Roscoe, the late Dominic Roscoe, who was a huge fan of Australian whiskey. Sullivan's Cove had just recently won the world's best whiskey, and it is the second longest running modern distillery in Australia, established in '94. And in 2014, it won the world's best single malt, the World Whiskies Award. And it's the only Australian whiskey to ever win that world's best. Now, I just checked the whiskey list, which is a sort of an online portal blog shop in Australia that's very good for lots of information out there. There are currently 318 distilleries in operation producing whiskey, gin, vodka, rum, and other spirits. Now, I spent a lot of time working in the Far East, working with a lot of Australians. I knew they made rum there because we used to have Bundaberg frenzies. But I never knew anything about whiskey because everyone talked about whiskey came along in 1992. I just didn't believe that this could have happened. Now, much of this Australian whiskey history comes from two sources, the stuff that I've found. There's an excellent whiskey blog called Whiskey Impressions by Kate Watts of What's Whiskey, written way back in November 2016. And there was a 20-page special from Whisky magazine that was printed in 2017. Now, the first fleet, a recorded landing of the first fleet, arrived in Australia in 1788. Now, at this time, distilling was already well established in Europe, the Caribbean, the Americas. So Australia's distilling history must have followed shortly afterwards, and certainly by the 1790s with the arrival of these first free settlers. Now, the first legal whiskey can be traced way back to 1793, according to the Whisky magazine article. So yes, they have been making whiskey in Australia and New Zealand for an awful long time. The 1820s saw the colony's first distillation regulations around the same time as our own 1823 Excise Act, you know, the distillery that started it all. And it really started the sort of the slow birth of Aussie whiskey industry. Oh, let's get some Tria Prima in. Now, Tria Prima is a nano distillery. This is a tiny, and it's run by a Brit, and he also is a boutique whiskey fan, so he is well up for this. Paul Shard and his wife Trang. And in 2017, they founded their distillery in Mount Barker, in the picturesque Adelaide Hills, and launching their whiskies in 2021. Now, whiskey in Australia only needs to be 2 years old be called a whiskey. Over here, it needs to be 3 years old. In America, it doesn't matter. It just needs to go through certain rules. It's whiskey when it comes off the still. It used to be whiskey when it came off the still here in the UK as well, until the 1915 Immature Spirits Act came into force and made it originally 2 and then 3 years old, which is why we have this 3-year limit today. What I love about Australian whiskey, and these cask samples turned up on our desks when we had loads of cask samples from big Scotch whiskies, and these just stood up. 2 years old, they stood up amongst these big Scotch whiskies. I very rarely, I always used to do my tastings blind, peel off the labels and put them all in blind and sneak in these world whiskies into a lineup of big Scotch whiskies, not to catch anyone out, but just to remove those preconceptions and just discuss the whiskey rather than, oh, it's good for a 2-year-old. I mean, is it good or is it not? I mean, is it good for a 2-year-old? What do you mean by that? What do you know about how many 2-year-old whiskies? But yeah, is it good or is it not? Simple as that.
So you were saying, just to clarify on that, Dave, in terms of so obviously 2 years minimum in Australia, and obviously as everyone on knows 3 years, but obviously as you're because obviously you've not called this a whiskey on the bottle, so even though it's Australian whiskey, ye are still not allowed to use that term.
No, we are definitely not. And you know, we can get away with it if it's a rye or bourbon, because it follows American rules, and we can bottle an 11-month-old rye, but we can't call it bourbon. So with that boutique rye company, as soon as we put whiskey in there, the fun police, as a logo, the fun police come in and hit us. So yeah, that's why we cross it out and put that boutique malt company. We have a little sticker that goes across the whiskey. We have the same for rye, for bourbon, for spirit. Well, we have to change it. Yes, because we couldn't put that boutique whiskey company, and it's a 2-year-old. Yes. Mm-hmm. But it is a single malt.
We've got some interesting tasting notes coming in there on that. Catherine says this is very smooth, could drink it like it's a bottle of ginger pop. Alice says watermelon on the nose and then a bit of bubble gum. Reminds me of grain. We've got citrus fruit. Actate followed by cherries, and then a vermouth, red vermouth. I definitely get the red vermouth. That's a great tasting note, David. Are you getting a flavor hit off these at the age due to smaller casks, size in some casks? I suppose that's a really good question. Obviously, we when people talk about, let's say, in Indian or American whiskey, or from kind of closer to the equator, there's a lot made of atmospheric changes and heat and environmental conditions affecting the wood, how the wood plays on the wood, how the whiskey plays in the wood. And obviously, you were saying the last one tasted as it did as a rye at 3 years old because of the fact it's a rye. The fact that this is a malt, and yet how do you think the location of it could affect the way the aging of it, or is it more, as the question asks, is it about the size of casks, or because it definitely doesn't taste. I know the cliche will probably be rolling out all night, but it doesn't taste as young as it labels. And as you just said, people say, "Oh, 2-year-old, what's that about?"
It's the quality of the wood that these Australian distilleries are be using. You know, they're surrounded by an established wine industry that also makes sherry and port style wines. They can't call that. They call it tawny and they call it apera. Apera was apparently short for aperitif. That's what they decided to call their. I mean, locally they still call it sherry and port, but on the label it's called tawny and it's called apera. Now this came out of a first fill Grant Berg Tawny cask. So this is a high-end Aussie port wine style maker called Grant Berg, and this was a first fill, which is why we're getting this beautiful depth of color and these big port flavors coming through, those fruity notes, that sort of plum, apricot, dried fruits, lots of dried fruits I had on here, sultanas, raisins, peel. And it really is rich and mouth-filling on the palate. Lots of big figgy notes, sort of medjool dates even. And there's quite a lot of chocolate notes coming through for me. I got a lot of chocolatey notes. And then there's sort of that savouriness coming through as well.
Craig said butter kiss popcorn. It's an interesting one.
Oh God, I've forgotten how good this is actually. It's been a while since I've had this one out, I must admit. Because there was only there's quite a small number. There's 200 and something bottles, I think, on this one.
On that same you were saying about the wood there. James has said that it would be interesting to taste the new make spirit for this and compare the difference at such a young age. Did you say this was cask strength? I only asked because 51.2% is quite low for such a young malt.
This one isn't cask strength. I can't see the little NCS on the corner there, but it's 51.2, but it isn't cask strength. We'd have if we go back, can I go back there? You can see this little NCS up in the top left-hand corner of the label. You can't see it too clear on here, but it does come out in gold foil effect on the labels. And we haven't put it on there, so that means this is not. So we have diluted this, or it's been diluted down to this strength for this bottling.
Interesting. So I mean, maybe this is a redundant question, but why, you know, if you're diluting it down, 51.2 seems very specific. You know, it's not 48, it's not 50.
Oh, we do that just for a giggle, but also we do taste them and think, where do we sit it for tasting? We do cask strength and we dilute it a bit. Sometimes we think, yeah, this is great at cask strength. Sometimes we decide to do them all at cask strength. Like our recent American ones, we just decided to do the whole collection because so many people asked for cask strength. Like I said, right from the beginning, boutique whiskey, we didn't even put an age statement in the early days. On the first 4 years of releases, none of them had an age statement. We never told you much about it at all. Then we started putting age statements, and they came into effect April 2016, I think. 15 or 16, they came into age statements. We started putting the age statements on there. Again, we'd never say if it's a single cask. It wasn't important to us. And we never said it was cask strength or not. Some of them were, some of them weren't. It wasn't important to us. What was important to us was, did it taste right when we poured it out of the bottle? More and more people have been asking for cask strength. So occasionally we'd slip in some at cask strength that we thought really worked at cask strength. However, we still never said it was cask strength. The little NCS on the top corner is fairly new, really, over certainly the last year and a half, maybe 2 years at the most. That we started putting up there natural cask strength. Nowhere on the label does it say it's a single cask. In the blurb on the website, definitely it will. And if we bottle it at cask strength, so generally we decide, or sometimes the distillery will decide and say they want this bottle. They'd like this bottled at a certain ABV. Some of the distilleries have stipulated they'd like it bottled at certain ABVs because that's what they do and that's where they feel their spirit sits best.
It's an interesting one because I'm very sympathetic to the idea that you should just let the spirit speak for itself, you know, and why be distracted by branding or color or age or ABV or anything, you know. Just if you enjoy it, you enjoy it. But a huge trend, obviously, is, as you were mentioning, when you were in Ireland before we came on live, that you had visited JJ Corrie and Louise and them, and they're very big on transparency and showing components of blends and what years and everything. And a lot of people do tend to, a lot of the industry seems to be trending in that direction, where a lot more people are calling for clearer transparency in terms of what's in the bottle, particularly in like, let's say, an Irish whiskey context, when there's so much third-party stock floating about the place. So yeah, it's interesting how you managed to strike a balance. Do you have any outside of what you're currently doing, do you have any personal thoughts on that, Dave?
Oh, I would love to be a lot more transparent. It's just that the rule makers, and I know, Louise would love to be a lot more transparent, but it is the rule makers. We get away with it sometimes on our labels by hiding it. We used to put tiny little ingredients on our labels for our blends, and we'd put percentages, distilleries and percentages, and we got told off with that. And it was hidden quite small somewhere on the label, like in a little blackboard somewhere in the corner. That's one of the stories of the label. The last time we did it with a blended malt, and we did it pictorially, like characters from 3 of our labels, because we can. And then they were all sitting in front of apple pies with different percentage rates of them. So you could very quickly count up the segments and work out the percentages of each malt in that blend. So we do it in subtle ways like that without having to actually write it down and get our legs slapped.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sorry.
No, that's how we've done it.
Okay.
Yeah, transparency, but not everyone allows us to do that. The rule, Compass Box have been wrapped over the knuckles for doing that. We can tell you verbally, but we can't put it on the label.
Well, we had a tasting with Compass Box about 2 months ago, and the same kind of thing came up, that they had said they would like to be more transparent than they currently are. Craig, it says a drop of water softens it a little, gives it a little more legs. Salted caramel and vanilla ice, excuse me, vanilla ice cream, dried fruits, baking spices, really tasty and easy drinking. Melvin says, do you lose a lot with angel share, i.e. temperature? Do you know, in terms of, sorry, I apologies if you said this and I missed it. This particular distillery, Dave, is this, whereabouts in Australia is this one? And then
this is in the Adelaide Hills. Right. In the Adelaide Hills, did I say it was Mount Barker? Mount Barker, yes, Mount Barker. This guy Paul, he sold a lot of his whiskey collection to fund this distillery, and it is a nano distillery. It is tiny. Yes, he had a big boutique whiskey collection, and was desperate to be part of our collections. When we released the first series, we sent a guy over to Australia to have a look, see if we could get any Australian whiskies, because we'd heard such great things about what's been going on over there. People like Dominic shouting about how good it is, but you couldn't get any over here. And lots of distilleries wanted to play, lots of distilleries, and we ended up with a collection of 8, I think, back then. And as soon as we came back and released it, so many more distilleries, well, why didn't you come to us? We would have played, and we were sent lots of different samples, and we very quickly could have a return to Oz, and it was also a good excuse to get our yellow brick road on the bottom of our, so it's a little shockingly bad pun of Return to Oz as a movie reference as well. Yeah. Nothing to do with Australia, with the yellow brick road on the banner. Just
it's not Kansas anymore.
Little things that make us laugh.
A wonderful allegory for capitalism and the New Deal, that film and book. Brilliant stuff. And in terms of Melvin's question, in terms of angel share evaporation, in terms of the Australian climate, do you know much about that, Dave?
I don't. I mean, I know they do have a lot bigger angel share than we'd have over here in Scotland, that's for sure. I mean, just go into the distilleries in England and then move into some of the German distilleries that I know have sort of 8 to 10% angel share in some of the German distilleries. I don't think I've written anything down on Australian distilleries, but they do have a much higher angel share. I'm reading not so long ago India and Taiwan. I've got a spreadsheet, something on angel share, but I don't think I've got anything on Australian distilleries in my files on their angel share. Most of the stuff that we have bottled has been quite young. In fact, most of the Australian whiskies that we've seen bottled are quite young, although I have seen, I think it's a 25-year-old has been released of the second sort of distillery. the Sullivan's Cove. I think they've just recently released a 25-year-old, but there couldn't have been much of that left. And I see the prices of whiskey in Australia, mind blowing for a 25-year-old Australian whiskey. But it's a little of liquid history.
It's interesting on that, Dave, because James there in the chat said, my girlfriend, she's Aussie, says it can get warm in that area, but it's quite similar to English weather because it's fairly southern for Oz. So yeah, I mean, that's the other thing. I suppose it's a large continent, so you know, where it's going to be. It's the same with, you know, we did a taste a few years back with Paul John whiskey, and you know, there's obviously the issue with the location, but also the altitude, the fact that they're quite high up, you know. So these things affect it as much as where they are in terms of relation to the equator and that. Brilliant. Will we come on to the next one, the Corowa?
The Corowa? Yes, we can come on to the Corowa. Now let's talk a little bit about Australian whiskey while you're pouring that again. Okay, Australian whiskey. Yeah, did you know Australia was the 4th largest whiskey producing nation in the world in the 1930s during American Prohibition? Probably didn't. I didn't know anything about Australian whiskey.
So actually, when you say that, Dave, I'd be more interested to know what the third one was.
It was the 3 biggest ones pre that were Scotland, Ireland, and Canada. And I would have Canada was way up there, as Ireland was sort of dwindling in the 20s and 30s. The first sort of slump of Irish whiskey started coming in the 20s, from what I remember reading, when the British Empire closed the markets to all of the Irish distilleries. Simple as that. That was it. That was the bottom line. Yeah, you want your independence, you can't use our markets, and they cut Irish whiskey off.
It was also, I mean, the Common Gael government that comes in 1922 after the revolutionary period is quite reactionary, and there's an extreme protectionist stance pursued by the domestic government for the next up until the 1960s, really, and any industry has to be producing a certain percentage, has to be produced for domestic consumption, no matter what it is. Right. And that is a massive blow to whiskey, because even if it is being drank locally, they're not it was a massively export industry. But yeah.
It was a huge export industry, yes, indeed.
Anyway, you guys didn't mean to interrupt.
No, the Australia was the world's greatest distilling cities. Melbourne was one of the big. By the 1930s, Melbourne was one of the world's great distilling. It had the Federal Distillery was capable of distilling 9 million litres of pure alcohol. That's whiskey, gin, and brandy at the time, and it had the world's largest mash tun. That was back in 1888. Australia was the UK's largest export market for whiskey and gin back in those days, and then protectionism came in the 1920s, which raised higher import tariffs and forced those Distillers Company Limited and Gilbey's into Australia to compete, and they both built large distilleries in and around Melbourne. So DCL came in and modelled their one-stop distillery, Corowa, which closed in the late 80s. On their Glenlossie and their Cameron Bridge distilleries, and it was huge. It became bigger than Federal, largest distillery in the Southern Hemisphere when they put their coffee stills in. And Australia became the world's 4th largest producer in the 1920s, all down to the Prohibition in the US, which sort of destroyed their rich history. It reached its peak in the 1950s, enjoying a 70% market share of the total whiskey category. Huge. However, by then, DCL and Gilbey started buying up the Australian distilleries and slowly dragged them down and closed them around the same time as there was this huge whiskey loch in Scotland. Call me cynical, but yes, that's what happened. However, the rum and the gin industries survived, but the whiskey was driven out, and that allowed DCL to flood the brands that we see today, Johnny Walkers and the Chivas, to come into Australia and kill distilling off in Australia. And they weren't making great stuff at the end because it's being controlled by here. So yes, it's died for about 5 years, and then Bill Lark sort of challenged the rules, much like we've done over here with the stills, and the birth of Australian whiskey can really be credited to just one man, and that's Bill Lark. And that's why we put the little lark on the labels that he had his hand in. So what we've got here is a 4-year-old. It's from the Corowa distillery. This is a New South Wales distillery on the Murray River. Oh, and this is another Tawny Australian port cask. It's been bottled at 48.5%. Our dangerous animal on here is the funnel web spider, which you can see down the bottom here. Now, this distillery is a really young distillery. All of the guys are under 30s. They're all into their Aussie rules footy, and they all play, and they all fight each other. And they're a pretty lively bunch. They're a good fun bunch to be around, to be honest. Their distiller is Long Dreadlocks, Bo, the dreaded distiller. We've got him on the cover there. Now, this is a family farming business. The farming business goes back in history. Some of the great grandfathers were introduced organic farming into Australia. They're also in the Rutherglen wine region, so lots of big wine casks all around them. And they built their distillery in the site of an old flour mill and heritage building, 1920s heritage, been empty for a long, long time. And they bought it famously for $1, which is why we have this $1 check on our label. That's the story that they told us, the $1 check. And it's not the first flour mill they bought. They bought another one a little while ago, and they turned that into a chocolate factory, sort of a fair trade, organic or whatever it is, chocolate factory. And this one they turned into a whiskey distillery. There's a great video. If you Google typical Australian, if you Google their sort of promo video on the Corowa, they tell you this lovely story about buying the mill, and then someone goes in there at the back, yeah, but it was full of pigeon shit, because it was just home to pigeons, which is they wanted pigeons on the label, or they wanted pigeon shit on the label. So this is why we've got the pigeon shit dropping down everywhere. That's a little story, but 4 years old. Big. We love this. We really love this. This was off a big Australian port cask, and there's about 520 bottles of this.
Brilliant. Alistair says smells like Airfix glue. And we said, how do you know what Airfix glue smells like? So there's another one. Dave says millet, take a while to pick anything up on the nose, but I can smell millet. Used to build Airfix models when I was younger, says Alistair, clarifying. And castor oil on the nose. I like the smell of castor oil. It reminds me of Waterford whiskey, says Melvin. That's an interesting one. And dried fruits with a hint of leather. I think you definitely, compared to the earlier one, which was Tawny Porter, the last one, it's much more obvious, I think, for me personally on this one, on the finish, that you definitely get that kind of classic kind of port flavors. I
get lots of chocolatey notes in those cherries again, but when I first nosed this, lots of toasted granary bread, and I regularly bake bread. I don't buy bread, I bake it all the time.
Interesting.
I love that sort of bread dough notes. There's also sort of a marmalade, really that rich dark marmalade that my father used to make. You wouldn't know what it would like, because it's personal to me, and you can't be wrong with tasting notes. I'm not a big fan of tasting notes. I'm much more fan of, do I like it or not? Is it tasty or not? Does it hold up?
Yeah, I think there is a bit of fun to kind of discerning something from it. I think a lot of our, it's obviously most taste is actually smell, and smell is one of our biggest triggers in terms of our own kind of recollection and life experience. And I think what people are exposed to is one of the reasons why they like not only like certain whiskies, but like whiskey full stop. I couldn't believe it. Dave, I was out, played for a local football team here in Scotland, and I was out with the lads on a team night out a few weeks back, and not all these lads, from their early 20s to their late 30s, group about 20 lads, and I was the only one there who drank whiskey, even though they grew up in this country where it's such a huge industry, So yeah, I think, you know, the what we're exposed to and our experiences with nosing things and that is a huge way we enjoy it. But I take your point about not being too pedantic or precious about them. If that makes sense. James, I'm getting whiskied marmalade or orange peeled, candied peeled taste. And yeah, dried fruits with a hint of leather. Says Alistair. So this one is, I'll just bring up, I actually didn't say the price. The last one I think was about, the Tria Prima is 139.95, and obviously you get 50% off this. And this one's 109.95. It's I must say it's growing on me, Dave, in terms of the finish lingers a bit longer the more it sits there and the more you go at it. In terms of how apologies if you said this already, what are we looking at in terms of quantity of release of this one?
This one was 592 bottles. So it's a big tawny port cask, and we diluted it. So there's quite a lot of this, but we loved it at this cask, at this strength. It's not cask strength. We loved it at 48.5, and yeah, it's one of the favourites of the team. Which is why we made a few more bottles of it.
Definitely,
it's a firm favourite from all of us.
No, it's absolutely gorgeous. So in terms of what Ian has said there, agree the tasting should be about whether you like it or not, so much what you can taste. Did a tasting last week at a guy at the distillery was giving I'm getting coffee, chocolate, etc. Asked what I was getting, and my answer was a bottle. Brilliant. You didn't say what distillery it was, Ian, so we'd be good to know that. So obviously we come up to the 1930s there, Dave, in terms of the history of Australian whiskey, but obviously it really must have started to go wrong. I suppose a bit like Irish whiskey, because if you were saying that the real kind of resurgence comes from 92, do you want to fill in a bit more of the in between?
Sure. Yeah, well, so 1930s it was huge, and what did I say? It became, yeah, it's how it was big. 1950s was in its heyday when it was enjoying a 70% share of the total whiskey categories sold in Australia. But it's by this time being controlled by foreign interests that they devalued the local whiskies and brought in the higher priced Scotch whiskies. And I remember someone told me, and I'm not sure if I read it in one of those two reports that I read, that the instruction from DCL was to make Australian whiskey standard quality. Just don't go overboard, just make it standard quality and drive it into the ground. And it was basically, they bought the Federal Distillery, they closed it down, and they slowly drove Corowa Distillery into the ground. And then there was no whiskey distilling in Australia for about 5 years until Bill Lark challenged this and then bought Australian whiskey back. Now in Tasmania had been dry for 153 years when he took his first license out. So before the 1990s, whiskey distilleries had to distill large volumes to warrant a constant surveillance by customs and excise. They had to have those customs and excise guys in the distillery, just like we used to when you see when you ever taken around a distillery. And if you read Bernard's book, everyone, you know, the customs guys had a cottage, had a room. They lived at the distillery. They had inspectors at every distillery, and that's what happened in Australia too. So the government regulations were changing and relaxing their monitoring procedures, and permitting licensing of smaller stills started to open the doors to a new wave of craft distilleries. And we say that birth really goes back to Bill Lark, who really did challenge it and challenged the Tasmanian, and he fired up his small still in Tasmania in the Lark Distillery in Hobart. First person to hold a distilling license for 153 years in Tasmania. So yes, he managed to change the 1901 Licensing Act requirements for the stills to be a minimum of 2,700 litres. That's how they changed it, and it really was this law that paved the way for this new wave of craft distilleries that are still springing up in Australia. Now, when I first started looking into Australia and those early distilleries, they did all have exactly the same stills that Bill Lark had, those little tiny stills. And there is actually a Bill Lark still, sort of Australian whiskey still of that design, actually in England today. There's a couple that learnt to make whiskey in Australia, fell in love with whiskey in their tour of Australia, and actually ordered an Australian still, and it's making English whiskey in Yorkshire today. It's pretty cool down in King.
No, certainly. It's interesting you're saying about these companies going in, and you were saying about the whiskey lakes in Scotland and price control. A similar, when Irish whiskey got into trouble in the after Prohibition, there was similar stuff happening with British companies buying up Irish distilleries and mishandling them or deliberately closing them down when they probably could have been made profitable and stuff. So yeah, I suppose that's capitalism for you. Craig says it's nice, easy drinking whiskey. I think the higher ABV, the first two might have dulled things. And he also asks, is the high price point more to do with transportation costs?
The high price is down to Australia. The prices of whiskey in Australia, they are expensive. These are all small craft distilleries. Yes, there's the shipping, obviously, which brings that price point. We're not making any extra margin on this. We just bottle them because we think they're fantastic. And we're geeks, is the bottom line. We want other people to discover these Australian whiskies. I think Australian whiskey is in really good health, and there's a great community in Australia for it. They're getting out of Australia is expensive. When they've come over here in the past, Overeem have been over here in the past. Lime Burners have been in the past over here, and they've made a little foray into it and then come up. The only person who's really sort of banging the drum over here has been Starwood, and they're a much bigger operation than all of these. Most of these are quite small, but a lot of the Australian distilleries that have been bottled are a husband and wife team, a father and son team, a father and daughter. There's two father and daughter or second generation modern distillers, actually. Kirsty Lark Booth and Overeem now back in family hands, which is kind of cool.
Yeah, because I mean, I know it's not Australia, but we actually had Cardrona on here for tasting a few months back. So it's definitely happening. It's interesting. I mean, I had a theory. This is probably going to bore a lot of people, but I had a theory around obviously the current economic climate. But a few years back, I was convinced that the 0% interest rate and quantitative easing, which was, as we know, creating asset price inflation within the economy, was driving a lot of the growth in whiskey. And it's interesting that if you look at whiskies now coming in, we recently released a Corowa whiskey exclusive to the Whiskey Shop, and obviously you see this with maybe some Canadian wines and whiskies and Australia, where higher wage economies, where obviously I think the average wage is higher in Australia than it is here. It's same in the Scandinavian countries, and then they're selling back into this economy. It can often potentially make things seem more expensive. Alistair said, I agree with tastings. We're quite often at the end of a tiring day, and once described them as degrees of yumminess with this. This is going back to the tasting notes with the score based on the number of ums in the word. James says, I'm enjoying this one quite a bit. Brilliant banter in the chat there. So yeah, I don't know if anything in terms of what's been said around tasting notes and enjoyment jumps out of you, Dave, or if you want to come on to the next one, the Chief's Son.
Yeah, we can do. I mean, the report that I read about the 2017 from Whisky Magazine suggests that there's so much going on in Australia. This is back then, a variety of grains, mash bills, still designs, which is something I wanted to see because I could only see the same type of stills being used. Still designs, lots of different still designs today. Lots of different yeasts are being used. We've bottled some great distillers who are using brewers' yeast, who are using wine yeast, and yeah, the wood program that they're using these days. These big wine and sherry casks that they have access to. Some of them are using refill bourbon as well, which are showing that distillery character. And I think that's starting to come across as their some of these wine casks, if they're leaving them too long, they do get a bit too heavy, too much tannic, too much wood coming through in their climate. They have, we talked about Angel Share, but there is sort of extreme weathers from the cool Tasmanian coast, and we've got some Tasman. We did bottle a few Tasmanians here. The Launceston, which was a very, very small batch, absolutely stunning in a first fill bourbon. Yeah, cool Tasmania to the tropical north of Queensland and the scorching dry interior. We have some really big extremes, and they are making many styles. Although we bottled couple of ryes and some malt whiskies. They are making corn whiskey. They are using other grains, oats and other health store whiskies, and even a bourbon style whiskey. So most of the grain that they use is locally. And then they are using some imported from Europe and the US, and they certainly are using some of the peated malts, although I have heard there are some Australian distillers actually using a local peat to smoke their malt. So let's come on to Chief's Son. Chief's Son.
While we're coming on to that, Dave, Jamie has said, I'm not sure actually if maybe he's talking about Pete's Son here. So maybe you could clarify, Jamie. Reminds you of Penderyn from a few years back, another couple of years, and I like it more. So that's an interesting comparison. So just wanted to get that in there. Sorry, David, back over to you.
Penderyn, yeah, I forgot that. Yeah, Penderyn. So there's a Penderyn shipyard that I used to in my old days as well. But yes, Penderyn Distillery. Of course, I thought someone was talking about Penderyn shipyards in my boat building days. But
no, another small whiskey producing country. Although, you know, I mean, we're as we've clarified so far in this chat, Australia is neither small in size or whiskey production. So Wales really is the small one in that regard.
Well, they were the leaders in terms of the rest of the British Isles over here. So they were well ahead of whether they started distilling in 2000. Well ahead of England, which started in 2006, and England now, more distilleries you can poke a stick at every day. I look, there's a new one.
Yeah, no, it's amazing because obviously I don't want to keep dragging this back this way, but obviously we've touched on Irish whiskey in this, and you know I'm biased because I'm from an Irish whiskey background, but everyone goes. I mean, and in terms of sales, it's true. Like the growth in Irish whiskey has been remarkable, but there's less distilleries open in Ireland than there is definitely in Australia and definitely in England as well. So it's interesting, but I suppose a few ones that produce on a massive scale skew things a bit.
Yeah. Okay, well, but this one is Chief's Son. It's a 5-year-old. It's another Australian single malt whiskey. It's run by a husband and wife team. They are on the Mornington Peninsula near Melbourne in Victoria. Founded by husband and wife Stuart and Naomi. Mackintosh, that's their surname, Mackintosh. We wanted to have them on this label in big long Mackintoshes. That was the original idea, but that was a little bit close to Scotland. Yeah, and we had the Fun Police hit us from that, so we ended up put them back in their day jobs, what they used to be. Naomi was a scientist, which is why she's holding a Bunsen burner, and Stuart was in the military, so we've got him in military fatigues. They are, of course, on the beach, on the barbecue, a beach barbecue. Yeah, it's a very, very small distillery. Yeah, very corny. We've got them beach barbecuing, coming in hot. A little beach bar in the back, and we have the dangerous animal, which is the great white, a very misunderstood dangerous animal in the background there, of course. This one is lightly peated, and they have one little. This distillery is tiny. Quite not as small as the micro one, but yeah, they have one still that's electrically heated, and they have a very, very small capacity, but they are laying stuff down, and they are having some of it. They're doing quite well in Australia, that's for sure. Now this has been in ex-sherry Australian Apara cask, and it's been bottled at 52.1%, and we got 462 bottles from this one.
Alistair's you've answered his first question about what cask it was. But he also says he doesn't get peat at all. I couldn't disagree more. I think it's not only peat, but it's quite a distinctive peat. It's almost like an older Lefroy type peat, you know. James has said Australian peat. I know you touched on grains there. Going into this, Dave, but specifically the peat in this, is it the domestically sourced one you were saying, or is it the imported one?
No, none of these are domestically. The ones that we bottled are all imported Scottish malt. There is a small element of lightly peated Scottish malt in this one, not all of it, but a small element of it. They want that light peatiness in it. I mean, their distillery Chief's Son, Mackintosh means son of the chief. And that's where they got their Chief's Son name. Their inspiration came on a holiday to Scotland from Australia. They went on holiday in Scotland and thought, well, we have Scottish heritage. Why don't we start a distillery like everyone does? And went back and built a little distillery in on the Mornington Peninsula. Now, they don't make their own wash. That's made by a local brewery.
I wonder. So I mean, if they're dealing with, I mean, Alistair said there in the chat that if it was a fry, you couldn't drink it. Which is interesting. But obviously, if that would be interesting to know if they're using if they're using imported peated malt, but someone else's wash, obviously handing that over to that brewery to brew that. I wonder, is that, obviously, unless the brewery is using, I imagine they're not using peated barley. Outside of that, must be, difficult for them to kind of turn things around and start using peated barley and then switch back without kind of cross-contamination. That's maybe an interesting challenge. I don't know if you know anything about that, Dave. But
I don't know anything about that, no. I mean, we just taste the liquid and bottle it, basically.
Of course, yeah, no, I was only speculating.
We get as many stories out of the distillers as possible, and we do talk to them when we're trying to, tell us some stories to sell it. But basically, we go over there and meet the people, taste some stuff, think it's delicious, ask for some samples or bring some samples back with us, and then take it from there. Basically, with all of our whiskies, and certainly with the New World, it's much easier. In fact, the whole world is a lot easier to deal with as an independent bottle of 10 years standing, much easier than when we first started. We always ask, where do you get your whiskey as an independent bottler? 3 sources. The distilleries themselves, which doesn't always happen in Scotland, although those doors have opened up to us over the years. We can go direct, and certainly, most distillers in Scotland are owned by the big boys, and it's very difficult to talk to them, but those doors have opened up to us over the years. A lot of our old Scotch comes from private collectors, which is all drying up now. People who invested in Scotch whisky during those whisky lock years, and beyond the whisky lock years, when all these distilleries were reopening after years of being mothballed. Private collectors and say the distilleries. Scotch whisky unique comes from brokers. Scotch whisky is unique in the world in that most distilleries feed brokers, what they're called bonders in Ireland, which are only just starting to come back, but they were actually feeding because 90% of the world today, or just under 88% of the world, don't drink whiskey out of a Glencairn. They drink it out of a rocks glass, or they drink it out of a highball, and they drink blended Scotch whisky. They don't single malts. And so nearly all distilleries are feeding, certainly the old established 95, less than the 95 these days, but feeding those brokers, and that's where we're buying fillings because of and we're able to get those sort of key picks for the Scotch whisky from the fillings with our relationships with these brokers that we've had over the years.
Yeah, and that's obviously how it has always been historically. I think that the first ones to bring bottling in house was only a handful of distilleries in the late 19th century. Obviously, it's people are very attached to whiskey brands these days, but obviously that's not really how a reflection of how it was historically. Alistair said yummy. Ali said no peat in the nose, but bam, there it is on the palate. David said peat-free nose, but on the palate, spicy peaty goodness. Rich and earthy, but taking a while to get it. Slow burner, says Craig. James says strange tasting note, but it's like a very light peaty molo mint. Not that it exists, but it's like I'm getting a light peatiness with a hint of fresh breath afterwards. Maybe you dropped the mint while out hiking, James, and picked it back up again. But the 5-second rule and all that. Alice says a bit more like Highland peat for me. I do like Highland peat whiskies. Martin says stealthy peat. Don't get it on the nose / palate, but really get it on the finish. David said if you have any left, nose the Tria Prima, and you might get a nice butterscotch. It's the Angel Delight. Craig says not a peated fan, but the sherry cask mellows the flavor. More you drink, nicer it gets. One that grows on you. Delish. I definitely agree that it grows. I think the last two have really been kind of slow burners. Really opened up the more I've sat with them anyway. And I think from some of the comments, people agree with that. Do you know, in terms of just the last question on the barley there, Dave? Sorry, is PPM? Do you know the PPM of this release?
I don't know the PPM. No. I seriously don't know the PPMs of these ones. No. Sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. And I can't find any reference to this on here. I'm just going to have a look through here. No, I never had any. The smoke is really subtle on the nose, and it's more wood char smoke than peat. And it really does sort of just drift in and out. It's a little more cedar wood cigar box sort of thing on the nose. Someone mentioned mint, and I had sort of burnt mint toffee on my notes on the palate. And I got that mintiness too, but that earthy peat starts coming through towards the end, and that little bit of gentle smoke.
Well, it's interesting. My grandparents had a farm. My uncle now has it back in Kerry. That's up on the side of a mountain. You know, one of these kind of not great land for a farm like most small Irish farms. And if you're going up the back end of the farm, you could find wild mint, like literally growing out of like boggy, marshy water, like, you know. And when you're kids, you kind of you go for this because it's interesting and it smells and it's just something a bit different. And yeah, there is as I hadn't thought of it till James's comment where there is that kind of you know, you're out in the wild, bit of mud and earth and dirt, and getting that kind of that when you kind of put it in your hands, that flavor that explodes into the air. It's interesting because Craig has said not a peat fan, but it mellows the flavor the more you drink it. Jamie said once this runs out, Bowmore darkest has a nice blend of sherry and peat. Bevan says licorice, plum, sweet cherry liqueur, nice balance of peat for me. Nice.
Yeah, it's very, very gently peated. It's not. I don't think it is even as much as a ppm as a Bowmore, but yeah, there's just a little bit in the background. Just I would probably say 6 to 10 ppm in the malt. I really don't think there's much in there at all. It's just that little bit of background stuff, but a small percentage. And yeah, it's really delicious. I think the big sherry cask really does it well.
Definitely. Craig has said any reasoning for the tasting order. If you want to, maybe I'll bring up the price of this one for anyone who's interested in picking it up. And we can maybe start slowly transitioning into our last one. And then do you want to let people know why we went for this particular order, Dave?
Yeah, I was just bringing the peat towards the end, basically building up to peat. Started with the rye, really because I just wanted to get that out of the way because I think it fits perfectly at the beginning. And then I went into the sherry, sort of the sherry casks and the port casks. That what I thought was lighter. Maybe I would have switched. I don't know. Switch the two around from the trick. It's the way I picked them when I first did the video. For every time we do a collection together, Boutique Whiskey does a collection, and we've only started doing that since September 2020. Before, whiskey just used to come out left, right, and centre. So as an independent bottler, we never had our own bottling plant. Initially, when I first joined, we never had our own bottling plant. Now we do. We have a bottling plant in Edinburgh. And we have full control of what we bottle and when we put it out. And so now we've been grouping them and actually putting thought behind a collection rather than just throwing them out willy-nilly without any information. So now they do come with a full information pack about everything that we know about them. And we tend to put them in a little groups like the Return to Oz. We did a world collection. We did a rye collection. We did a whiskey series from Northwest Euro Express. We did a train trip right across Europe with the Scandinavian, and we've recently just released a series of American whiskies, which would change the labels all again. As I mentioned, so many people are starting to do boutique style labels now that we thought we'd better up it up, and we've just released a series of baseball cards of American whiskies, which I just think are just so cool. They look like vintage baseball cards, and we've got all the distillers in positions on a baseball field doing their stuff as a collectible cards. So I put them in the order for the order that I thought worked best for the tasting, starting light, finishing smoky.
You put them in the order that you thought works best. Who would have thought, huh? Brilliant.
If I've got it right, and you've tasted them all in the same order, we should live forever. That's the theory.
Oh, well, brilliant. That's good to know, actually. Let's see, there you got more than you bargained for, folks, with that £25. That's great value. Because Stephen has said there in the chat as well, hardly peated, almost no peat in the taste. I find this extraordinary. I mean, I genuinely get quite a lot. No, not like super peat, like it's a a big Ardbeg or something, but I get quite a lot of peat, particularly on the finish.
Highland style, isn't it? That Highland style of, I would say the Highland style of peat rather than that big, yeah, that big peat is. I've got 5 different styles of peat in test tubes on my desk here somewhere.
But I bottle killed a I don't know if that's I never normally use that term, but I finished off a bottle of Lefroy cast strength. I think it was batch 7 or 6, one of the older batches, only a couple of weeks ago. And there's something with the kind of charcoaliness that it catches the back of the finish that really reminds me of not necessarily, it doesn't remind me of Islay whiskey at all, but just specifically that type of Lefroy that is a bit more charcoaly than some of the other Islay peats, that kind of that burnt wood flavor, which maybe you're right, maybe is more of a kind of a Highland characteristic. I don't know. I'm not that good. I don't know anything about whiskey. I just blag it. You have some peat samples there, Dave, you were saying?
I have, yeah. I've got Highland peat from Orkney on my desk. I've got Highland peat from Brora region, so Brora, Clynelish. I've got peat from Tomintoul up in the Highlands Speyside. I've got Ardnamurchan Merkin peat, and I've got some peat from the Lefroy field, so from Islay, and they're all very different when you burn them. Very different. And they all, I mean, yeah, they don't smell of much at all. I've got a big block of Lefroy peat somewhere. Here it is. Big block of Lefroy peat here.
Is that, did you buy a square foot or whatever they sell, or no, did you creep down the middle of the night and take it?
We were just traveling back from one of the distilleries one weekend, and it was just all laying out there. So just put a bit in my bag, yeah.
No, I actually wasn't expecting you to say that. I was only being facetious, but brilliant. As I said, if you sniff the empty glass, it smells like cinnamon, which is both an amazing prompt for us to go on to the Riverbourne and also an interesting suggestion. So brilliant.
Riverbourne. Okay, this is a batch 2. Yeah, all of these were batch 1s. The first time I'd ever tasted any of these distilleries. We had bottled our first Australian whiskey back in 2015-16. We bottled 2 batches of Overeem, and we bottled another batch with this release. In our first collection of Australian whiskies we bottled, they were all batch 1s. I'd never tasted any of them before. I hadn't heard of most of them before. Starwood, we did bottle some Starwood. We did bottle some Riverbourne. This is our second batch of Riverbourne. It's another 2-year-old. It's Martin Pye, the grumpy old man of distilling in Australia. He's known as the grumpy old man. It's a welcome return from my. I thought the first batch of Riverbourne was superb, and this is one of their heavily peated versions. So this is a distillery that's sort of southeast of the capital, Canberra. So it's right up in around the Canberra region, and it is the home of Australia's oldest distiller, Martin Pye, known as the Grumpy Old Man. Now he uses 2 types of barley. He uses a heavily peated Scottish malt and local malt from Australia. So they're the 2 malts he uses, and this is the heavily peated version. He tends to use small casks, so this is quite a small batch. Our first batch was really quite small. This is just 260 bottles. A cask known as Roll Out the Barrel is the cask manufacturers of this lot. Roll Out the Barrel is very similar to an STR cask. So they're 100-litre casks that have been made from American and French oak staves, ex-wine. So toasted, shaved, recharred casks, like a STR, shaved, toasted, recharred cask, but it's called Roll Out the Barrel. Ex-wine casks, just a small batch. Now, all of his whiskies, so it's called the Riverbourne, and all of his whiskies that he bottles himself. He's a bit of a character in Australia. He's a much loved character in Australia. He's a proper geek. He's a scientist, a mathematician, a 3rd-generation pharmacist, and he has a passion for the sciences. And started distilling. This is just him and his buddy in a shed, hand mashed. Look them up on a website. Go to their website. Yeah, they hand mash these things. It's his handmade whiskey. When we talked to them, when we had the first car samples and fell in love with what the man, the attitude, the whiskey, and he's telling us stories about his distillery and about these bloody wombats that are everywhere that just burrow into everything.
Is that what I was literally gonna be my first question? I was like, is that what they are?
Yeah.
Because I was like, I mean, koalas don't live underground. I was like, do they have moles in Australia? But they don't look like moles, but wombats. There you go.
They burrow into everything, and so we thought we'd have this whack-a-mole sort of theme to the label, which he thought was quite funny. Not that he does that, but they're just a pain. You know, they're the pain in the ass to him. And he names all of his whiskies that he releases himself after the James Bourne novels. Is it Bourne novels?
Is that
Yeah.
Jason Bourne? Is that the Bourne?
Jason Bourne. That's it. The books. I've read the books. They're movies as well, aren't they? But yeah, Jason Bourne. That's it.
I didn't know they were books. They're still the ones with Matt Damon, isn't it?
There were books. Yeah, they're definitely this whole series of books. A lot more books than movies. That's for sure. Yeah, so we had them dressed up as villains, stealing everything.
Is Alistair saying Mark Wahlberg? Is that what you're saying, Alistair? In that, or no? Sorry, I thought someone was trying to mouth something there on the camera.
So he's got the Bourne series, Identity, Ultimatum, Supremacy. All of his whiskies are named after that, and which led us on to this Whack a Wombat with all the wombats as the baddies. We've got the redacted across. Everything's been redacted, and they're all the wombats are all dressed up as villains, stealing everything. All of the still, because they do burrow into the still. Our deadly animal in here is hidden. There is a little snake halfway through there. You can't see it very well. It's called the what's it called? It's called the death. I think it's something like the death adder, common death adder. I think it's called. Yeah, common death adder. Yeah, just have them left, right, and center. So it is hiding in the burrow with the wombats there. It's pretty difficult to see actually.
As opposed to your extraordinary death adders.
Yeah. It's the common one. That's the uncommon one. Yeah.
Yeah.
Everything to kill you in Australia. I think my favorite deadly animal of all of them is on the Launceston label, which is a Tasmanian, and we got the Ricky Pontin on there. I don't know if you're followers of the cricket.
Well, I was actually going to say, because I can't believe that we've gone this far before the crickets come up. With
I was listening to it this afternoon. Yeah, we got the Ricky Pontin as a deadly animal on our Launceston label, or Launceston they call it over here. Over here we call it Lanson if you're down in Devon. The Ricky Pontin, he's a deadly animal. We've got the box jellyfish on there. We've got the jumper ants and the drop koala on as a deadly animal on the Florio label. Yeah, lots of deadly animals to play with.
Brilliant. We got some excellent comments coming in. James says this one is really surprising in a good way. 2-year batch 2, but honeyed, medicinal peatedness. I wish all medicine tasted like this. Dave said oyster shells on the nose, germaline on the finish. Alice says, I was saying you didn't realize that they were books. That's a reference to the Bourne identity one. Jason Bourne. Jamie says tobacco hints. I definitely can get tobacco hints, particularly like a color's choice, a much lighter tobacco. Could definitely see that for like hand rolling tobacco. Craig says, for me, it's typical TCP hit of peated whiskey. However, it is another grower. First sip is harsh, but the second and third, you get used to it and really nice. Getting black pepper and cinnamon. Sweet peats, as Alistair, going to have to listen again on a train with tunnels are playing havoc. Or sorry to hear that, Jamie. It's definitely we were talking about the absence of peat in the first one. I mean, definitely get the peated here, but on the nose, when I first noticed it, I thought this was almost like an ex-bourbon space side, and then you taste it, and it's not that at all. It's really a real dichotomy in inside a glass. I find personally compared to the first one, which maybe contradicts what people were saying in the chat, because everyone else found not the first one, I mean the first peated one, the last one, because everyone else in the chat was saying they got no peat on that one. Craig says, having only tried Belgrove Rye and Starward from Australia, it's nice to learn more about what they have to offer. Brilliant. I mean, I don't know if there's anything, either your thoughts so far on the Ashes and Baz Ball or whatever it's called, Dave, or anything else you wanted to part us with on Australian whiskey. While maybe everyone at home gives us their preference as to what they enjoyed most and in what order tonight. And then in the meantime, I'll dig out the discount code for everyone. So there you are, Dave. What you want to address, the whiskey again, or the Ashes?
Oh, I think the first game in the Ashes was superb. Make a test match last 5 days again. Absolutely, that's what we want to see. But today, I think England have gave some really cheap wickets away. Yeah, some really cheap wickets away. Stupid wickets today. But hopefully, I mean, we're doing really well. We're rolling along pretty well, I must admit. But it's a really
what's
good
the score today? I mean, I was actually I listened to a bit of it yesterday, and I know Australia were 190 something or 200 something for 3 at close of play yesterday or something around that. I've been actually quite busy today. I haven't had a chance to listen to it. There's the GA quarterfinals are on this weekend, so that's kind of taken my focus away. What's the state of play at the moment?
Well, Australia were 416 all out.
Right.
They lost their last wickets for like 100 runs, so there's quite a lot gone out very quickly. England are 278 for 4 after 61 overs, which is pretty good. They're just 138 runs behind, but they gave away Root gave away his wicket just cheaply. Yeah, one guy was on 98 and just was starting to swing into their spin bowler and just stepped straight out of his street. This bowler said, "Oh, I know what you're doing," straight to the wicket keeper.
Was that Burstow? I think I saw that. I caught that on the news briefly.
Just ridiculous. But yeah, I think they've settled down again at the moment, and we've got a good batsman in there with Stokes at the moment. So hopefully we can hold it.
Brilliant. Yeah. Well, I've dropped the discount in the chat, folks. So WS16 or TO, return to Oz. I get teased about my pronunciation of or. I say or, but it's probably RTO. I don't know how you'd say it, Dave. But R for Robert. And this is probably, of all the tastings I've done since joining the whiskey shop, Dave, I must say this is probably one of the ones which has bounced around in terms of preference. The most we've got. Craig has said 3, which would be the Corowa, would it? Was the third one. Yeah. And then 2, 4, 1, 5. Dave Alistair says Chef's Son for me. Then we've got David is in with the first one, the Gospel. Kirsty said the Gospel as well. Generally not a rye, but Gospel, says Ian and Claire. Alistair's gone for the Tria Prima. So maybe the more I look at it now, maybe one has come out, has pulled out ahead, but it's definitely, normally there's 1 or 2 whiskies that really stand out. But Melvin's gone with 4, and then we've got 5 there from Neil. So it's definitely not. Yeah, there's obviously something there for everyone, which is great, and that's unique for these tastings.
That's exactly what you want to do as an independent bottler. Something for everybody.
100%, yeah, and I think you've definitely nailed it, folks. I definitely would recommend picking up a bottle of this, any of these. They're also quite limited and have been sold out in a lot of places. So do get them while they are still available. So I know that some of them are obviously in a bit of a higher price point, but with the 15%, a lot of them, it's a big chunk off for a few of them. So it'd be great if you picked up a few bottles. So that's WS16 or TO. David has asked what's next. We have a Loch Lomond tasting coming up, David. That we had a slight delay on stock that will hopefully go on sale tomorrow. That is going to take place on the 13th of July. We are then hoping, we're in the process of moving warehouse at the moment, the whiskey shop. But all going to plan, we will then have an Annoch tasting on the 20th. Sorry, an Annoch tasting at the end of the month, and in between we're going to have a Tobermory Ledaig tasting on the 20th. So there'll be 3 tastings in July, and those are the ones that they'll be in that order: Loch Lomond, Tobermory Ledaig, and then Annoch, all going to plan. There's a possibility one of them might have to get pushed back a week just with the warehouse move. We bottle these all in house, so it might just mean we're a bit stretched on manpower, but all going well. That's the order. Dave, it's been fantastic having you on. It's been a really, really informative evening, and I think everyone from the chat, it's been really active and engaged, and people seem to have really enjoyed it. Couple of separate direct messages that I've just come in there on the chat as well, saying how good a tasting it was. So thank you so much for your time. Will you come on again, maybe with a few different maybe different style releases, maybe not from Australia, from the Boutique Whiskey Company, because your knowledge is fantastic.
I say yes to everything. Like, I mean, yeah, I've always volunteer for absolutely everything, because you never know where it ends up, and that's probably why, you know, I remember someone coming to me and said, "How would you like to work in Thailand, Dave?" And I said, probably not. Where is it? No, where is it? I think I said, and then, you know, next minute I spent 7 years working in Thailand. So, yeah, I say yes to everything, because you never know where it's going to lead to. Could be a giggle.
Brilliant.
It could be a disaster. I remember when I landed in Thailand thinking, "Oh my God, what have I done?" But yeah, you make the best of it. Yeah.
Fantastic. Yeah, Thailand's always been on the bucket list for me. That's brilliant. Yeah, no, we got some great comments there to part with. Ali and Katie said, can we have that Boutique Whiskey Company bourbon and rye tasting? I'll definitely have a chat with your colleagues, Dave, and see if we can make that happen. Alistair's asked for about Middleton tasting. Middleton, I would be well open from that. I love Middleton. But we'll have to see. We'll have to have a chat with the powers that be. So yeah, they're all good suggestions. And thanks for all the lovely comments, folks. And we'll hopefully see you on our next tasting. Thanks again, Dave. Really appreciate your time this evening and your wealth of knowledge. And if there's anything we didn't address tonight, folks, that you're interested in, just drop me an email and I'll pass on the question to Dave or someone else on that particular whiskey, and we'll get the question answered.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, brilliant. Well, enjoy the rest of your evening, folks. And we'll catch you on the next tasting.
And you can always find me on social media. I'm always there. Boutique Dave, everything. And I answer questions anywhere. Yeah.
Brilliant. Excellent. Well, thank you, Dave, and thank you everyone for joining, and we'll catch you all on the next Digital Drams. We'll see you, folks.
Thanks for having me. Cheers.
Bye.